what de Waal found instead was that the chimps who come to the top, who manage to stay there, are chimps who are, they're strong for sure, but they're also, they also engage in a lot of mutual social interactions, and they pay a lot of attention to the females. And so what it appears to be the case is that, and this is so cool, it's so cool. If you want to be king of the chimps, you have to be a good king. And you might say, well, what does good mean? Because you think of that as a moral abstraction. What does good mean? Good king? Okay, let's figure it out. Being torn to bits in a violent insurrection seems like failure. Okay? So, being constantly hounded from all sides because you're too rough and not social enough, that doesn't seem like an optimal solution. Maintaining order in the hierarchy so the hierarchy maintains its structure across time and so that everybody's attended to properly decreases the probability of violent insurrection a lot. So you might think, well, what the chimp is trying to do, the chimp at the top is trying to structure the dominance hierarchy in such a way that it can maintain itself without violence in a productive manner with many individuals across large spans of time. Now, there's nothing abstract about that. Now, you might say, well, there may be different ways to do that. It's like, fine, yeah, there probably are. It's just like you can be a plumber or you can be a lawyer. You know, there are different ways, potentially, of solving that set of problems. But it's within a bounded universe. There are things you can't do. There may be many things you can do, but there's certainly things that you can't do. Okay, so then that's really useful to know, because what we can surmise from that, potentially, is that even higher order morality is something that emerges. It emerges as a consequence of social interactions between motivated beings across large spans of time, and that there's actually a pattern to that. There's a pattern. So that would be the pattern that characterizes the stable hierarchy. So now what is that pattern? That's where you get to mythology. So because this is where people differ from chimps. So you might say, well, why did the chimps act the way they do? And you might say, well, that's because their parents acted that way. And then you might say, well, that's because their parents acted that way. And you can make that argument going as far back in time as you want. And I already made it at one point going all the way back to lobsters, right? 400 million years. That's a dominance hierarchy. So how to behave in a dominance hierarchy is something that's been figured out across 400 million years of evolution, at least. Now, you can infer two things from that. One is, you're adapted to a dominance hierarchy, because that bloody thing is old. So you have literally, the forces of selection have shaped you such that if you weren't able to function within a dominance hierarchy, you weren't going to survive, someone would kill you, and you weren't going to mate. Okay, so you're prepared for the damn dominance hierarchy. Now, the next thing is, you can observe and transmit information across the hierarchy because it's a living thing that continues across time. So it kind of has its own structure that perpetuates itself across the generations. So with the chimps, for example, the status of a family is heritable. Now, we don't know if that's a sociological phenomena or a biological phenomena or whatever, but it doesn't matter. It's still the case. So, and I think that's because it's probably easier for high-status animals to produce high-status offspring. Obviously, why not? They have better access to everything, and they're more confident, so it stands to reason. Okay, then there's the constraints of the dominance hierarchy itself. Because it's a particular kind of structure, it has to operate within particular kinds of principles. Okay, so, we were chimps, and then our brains started to grow. We discovered how to use fire, we discovered how to use language, we discovered how to imitate each other, and we're really good at that. It was frequently the case, and I'll tell you the stories, that archaic people like the Sumerians conceptualized their leader as the incarnation of God on earth. And he had responsibility to act that way. It's a very common human cognitive operation, right? The Japanese were doing that right up to the Second World War. And they still do it to some degree. So it's like this is natural human thought. The leader is an avatar of God. What's God? We'll leave that question aside for now. What's a good avatar? Well, a good avatar is whatever has sovereignty and authority. Well, what is sovereignty and authority? Well, we're trying to figure that out. Sovereignty and authority is whatever stabilizes the dominance hierarchy with multiple members across large spans of time in a way that won't be overthrown. We don't know the answer to it because it's an ongoing investigation, and a lot of it's worked out at the behavioral level. But then once we started to observe it and tell stories about each other and imitate each other, we could start encapsulating that in stories. And so, what time is it? 3:11? Okay, one more sentence, I'll give you a break, then I'm going to tell you one of the world's great stories. Okay, so here's the idea. We're banging, so just like when I'm playing with my son, physically, we're trying to optimize the interaction. And the way we do that is by calibrating each other's strengths and weaknesses and each other's emotional reactions in a way that makes it fun and interesting and exciting and almost terrifying, and that in a way that both players really want the game to continue. Okay, how do you do that? Well, you can't say. You can say, well, you have to play fair. That's a reasonable proposition. You can't hurt the kid. You know, there's arbitrary things you can't do. You can draw out some general principles, but basically you have to figure it out on the fly. Okay, that's how we organize our hierarchies. We figure it out on the fly. But then what do? We watch those hierarchies over thousands of years and communicate about it. And so we're trying to figure out what the hell is it that we're up to exactly. And then we even take it a bit further, which is not only what is it that we are up to, but what is it that we should be up to? It's like, how do you idealize the dominance hierarchy structure, and what should be at the top? And the proposition is something like, an avatar of the highest value is the thing that's at the top. And then the next question is, what the hell is that? And the answer to that is, we're not smart enough to conceptualize it properly, partly because it's an emergent property. It's very complex, biological, sociological, emergent phenomena. And so we're trying to close in on it. And that's what we're doing when we're telling stories. We're trying to close in on it. What's the ideal human behavior? So, I have a friend visiting right now, and he writes thrillers. He's written like 20 of them. And he writes comic books like Batman and Wolverine and so on and so forth. And so he's interested in... So the thriller genre, most of what he writes about are vigilante stories, you know, where someone is wronged, their family is threatened in some manner. Maybe it's outside the normal strictures of the law, and they're supposed to do something about it. So I asked him what the hell he was up to, because he's a smart guy. I thought, well, why are you writing these thrillers? Why is that the genre that captures your interest? Very highly verbally intelligent, this guy, and he's very well educated. I thought, well, what are you up to? And he said, well, it seems to be something like this. I'm trying to figure out, so usually in a thriller, the force that is attacking the castle, the structure, the family, is some male gone mad. So it's like Animal Man, you know, some brutal psychopathic guy or a serial killer or some like arch criminal or something like that. Same thing you see in comic books. It's like, okay, that's like the masculine end of the monster. Okay. But then the protagonist, say, typical protagonist might be a man trying to protect his family. It's like, okay, what do you do when a monster attacks something that you love? Well, if you're just like made out of tissue paper and gelatin, you know, you just fall over and die, and then the monster comes in and steals everything you have and kills everyone, and that's the end of the story. It's like, okay, you have to meet force with force. Now that's a weird thing, eh? Because if you got a monster on the outside, and you're in the inside, and you're also male, we'll say, for this example, if you don't allow yourself to be the kind of monster that the monster is, he's going to win. So then the question is, how do you allow yourself to be the kind of monster that's capable of protecting things without turning into the monster? Well, so all his books are explorations of that. It's like, okay, here's a limit situation where even the rules aren't working. Your family's on the line, the law can't protect you. What do? Well, we don't know. Do you curl up and die? Do you hide in the basement? Do you make a safe room? Do you move to another state? You know, do you just take it? Do you fight back? Do you arm yourself? It's like, who knows, right? What's the right thing to do? Well, the right thing to do doesn't seem to be to let that win. Okay, so he's laying out variants, simulations of responses, you know, and he has all sorts of reasons for doing so. So that's partly what we're doing with stories, right? We're not only representing what it is that we're doing, And if we're not, you'd go and watch the movie and you'd say that wasn't very realistic. It has to be a good enough model of the world as it is so that you find it credible. It can twist a principle or two around and ask you to suspend disbelief for the purposes of exploration. You know, like what would it be like if you had X-ray eyes, you know? It's sort of like a superhero thing. And people will put up with that because it's an exploratory process, you know. You can't just break a bunch of rules arbitrarily, though, because people get bored of the story, right? It's not a realistic simulation. You're playing out simulations in a moral landscape. So, and I would say the simulations that have worked best are archetypal. So there's deep themes that are kind of, they're like templates, and they're somewhat vague. The details have to be filled in your own life. But there are broad narrative themes that are the fundamental framework within which the specific moral hierarchy that you need has to be built.